Is the U.S. interfering in Bolivia? President Evo Morales says it is, from coca farming to natural gas to local politics. We look at the Bush administration's policies in South America's poorest nation and what the future holds for Bolivia. From the Plaza Murillo in La Paz, Bolivia, I'm Avi Lewis, and you're watching Inside USA. Bolivia is a classic case of the resource curse. From its vast deposits of silver that lined the colonial treasure chests of Europe to the 29 trillion cubic feet of natural gas it has today, all the riches in the world have produced the poorest country in South America. But Bolivia today is in the midst of historic changes. Its first indigenous president, Evo Morales, was swept to power in a landslide in 2005 and immediately went after multinational oil companies, forcing them to hand over much more of their profits to the government. Now, the United States has been predictably critical of Bolivia's leftward tilt. In fact, the State Department last week went so far as to use the T word, saying that the country shows new potential as a possible site for terrorist activity. No coincidence, Evo Morales is a former coca farmer and a strong defender of both the commercial and the cultural uses of coca, which is central to the indigenous identity here. The United States wants to ban all coca production and sees it through the prism of the war on drugs. And that tension is where we start with this week's Inside Focus and Monica Villamizar on the growing row over the coca leaf.
A site like this is exactly what the Bush administration does not want to see. For these are coca leaves, the raw material which, when processed chemically, turns into cocaine. It is a leaf that symbolizes a massive Washington foreign policy failure. Here in Bolivia, the coca plant is intrinsically linked to these people's way of life. In the region of Los Yungas, in the foothills of the Andes, tens of thousands of families depend on the coca crop to survive. Chewing the leaf is also a traditional way of life.
Exactamente, nosotros cultivamos la coca porque es el único medio.
We grow the coca because it's the only way we have to survive.
No hay otra planta que lo.
But the fortune of the coca plant is at a crossroads in Bolivia. The United States has spent billions to stop the cultivation of the coca plant, and that has brought Washington into conflict with Bolivia's president Evo Morales, himself once a coca farmer. Back in 1988, under pressure from the US, Bolivia criminalized coca. Production of the lucrative crop plunged, wiping over $500 million off the economy. Coca farmers led by Morales protested, with often fatal consequences. Nervous of the political momentum a left-wing indigenous coca farmer was gaining, America attempted to discredit Morales. But his popularity soared, and in 2005, he became the first indigenous president.
We told Bush there won't be a zero coca policy here, which doesn't mean there will be freedom to grow the crop freely either. He didn't like that. He didn't like that we're now sovereign and we have our dignity back. Before, the US Embassy and the DEA commanded eradication operations.
The Bolivian government has tried to find a balance that allows coca to be grown for traditional uses, but not for the production of cocaine.
The rural area of Los Yungas in Bolivia is the only territory in the country where the coca crops are not regulated by the government. Current President Evo Morales decided this, saying that in this region, the coca leaf has been used traditionally and is not linked to trafficking activities. However, this law has been very unpopular with the US administration and even the UN, who claim that ever since it was put in place, the amount of coca in the region has multiplied.
Now the fight has flared up again. In March, the International Narcotics Control Board, which monitors UN drug control conventions, called on Bolivia to eliminate all uses of the coca plant, including coca leaf chewing. This despite a 1988 UN resolution that recognized the traditional use of coca for indigenous people. The reason, the US has spent billions on a decades-long so-called war on drugs that has produced no real results. criminalizing even the most traditional use of the plant could be the last desperate way to salvage a failing campaign. Farmers in Los Yungas fear they will end up paying the consequences.
I will never have a good concept of the Americans. They force us to eradicate coca crops and we get nothing in exchange.
Every word that the U.S. president says about Bolivia affects coca growers' lives. Of course we are watching what goes on there and these elections.
Everyone who arrives in La Paz, the world's highest capital city, will find it hard to breathe. This place is 3,600 meters above the sea level. But indigenous communities of the Andes had figured this out thousands of years ago. Chewing the coca leaf actually helps the body regulate oxygen and glucose levels.
And when it comes to market, coca growers like Don Luis have to account for every sack of leaves, so that nothing is diverted to the illegal trade.
If this controlling entity didn't exist in Bolivia, the country would be a second Colombia.
But former president and opposition leader Jorge Quiroga says that more coca is being grown than is needed for traditional use.
They change the policy, and they basically have a policy that says, coca yes, no cocaine. That's like if I was to tell you that I'm going to eat 10 steaks with potatoes every day, but I will lose weight. That simply does not work. And in reality, what you have is an increase in the production of drugs coming out of my country. And unfortunately, we are reverting all the progress that we had made.
The battle over the coca leaf is just one front line in an increasingly antagonist relationship between Bolivia and the United States. Evo Morales recently accused the U.S. government of funding the opposition to topple him, a charge the U.S. State Department denied.
The conspiracy against my government is headed by the U.S. ambassador. U.S. aid, with funds that come from American taxpayers who think that they are helping the Bolivian people, is using the money in a dirty campaign against my government and especially against me.
All the balloons they throw about USAID is to distract people from the biggest threat to democracy that we have had in Latin America, which is the Chavez Project and the puppet regimes that are putting it forward.
Bolivia continues to express a desire to expand its coca farming and even wants to export coca products. The Bush administration has warned that exporting those products would put Bolivia in violation of its international agreements and risk tens of millions of dollars in U.S. aid. The fortune tellers of La Paz say they can read the future in the leaves of the coca plant. But the future of the plant itself and the people who depend on it for their livelihoods remain uncertain.
Back on the streets of La Paz, coca production is just one of many issues where the Bolivian government accuses the United States of interference. In fact, the most serious one is tacit U.S. approval for a separatist movement, which has sprung up in the gas-rich province of Santa Cruz. There, the mainly white elites have been pushing for more autonomy from the government here in La Paz. In fact, they've gone so far as to visit Washington on their own, trying to restart free trade talks that the government of Evo Morales has abandoned. So to get deeper into the U.S.-Bolivia dynamic, we brought together two Bolivians with very different points of view. Here's our conversation. Sylvia Rivera is a sociologist and activist who's an expert on the history of indigenous struggles in Bolivia. She's also a passionate advocate of the coca leaf. And Rafael Loaiza is a senator in the Bolivian parliament with the right-wing Podemos party. He's a well-known anti-Morales voice here in La Paz. So last week, the U.S. State Department described Bolivia as having a new potential as a possible site for terrorist activity. Sylvia, what does that signify in terms of the U.S. relationship towards Bolivia?
Well, I think that the U.S. has passed through many stages of strategies for intimidation since September 11 to this long term
of terrorism.
And terrorism can fit anything, you know, from bank robberies to drug dealing to whatever.
Rafael,
So
what do you think of the way that the United States is shifting its discourse around Bolivia?
Well, I don't really think that the United States are shifting its discourse in Bolivia. we had these intimidations, as Sylvia's put in the past during the Cold War, but it was not just the states who were trying to get themselves involved in this country. We had the Soviet Union. We had a lot of efforts to trying to, turn Bolivia into the other side of the bloc. And now we are holding the same fights here. I don't think that the United States is interested in Bolivia, besides the fact that this government has a sponsor, which is Hugo Chavez, and I think that's the main interest of the United States, to try to, shoot Chavez, trying to point us.
No, but I think there's a reason behind that, which is we are Indian.
You think the United States sees this as an indigenous uprising, the government?
No,
of
I
Evo
think
Morales?
that they want to link terrorism with cocalero cultivation and indigenous uprisals, because indigenous people are starting to really shake off this burden.
What the Morales government says that it has been doing over the last 2 years is recapturing the natural resource wealth of the country in order to redistribute it to the impoverished indigenous majority.
Yeah.
Is this project working? Can it happen? Is it what needs to happen in Bolivia? And what will it do to the relationship with the powers in the north?
What is happening in Santa Cruz at this moment? 40% of the population is trying to preserve the wealth that they got during all the Republic times. And this wealth was not in despite of the other 60%, which is mainly indigenous. And now, as politics is simplifying reality, this 60% led by Evo Morales is blaming the other 40%. And now what we have is Bolivians against Bolivians.
Now that the state is in hands that are not so easy to twist, then they turn to autonomy.
I recognize that autonomia is the response of the wealthy people, or the people who the system worked for them, to the indigenous primordialism of Evo Morales. Evo Morales, when arrived to the power, just recognized half of the country as part of the country and blamed on the other half for the indigenous dispossession and all that. These people, these 4 million people, is trying to defend their wealth, trying to build this
Sorry,
now we're getting down to it. Go ahead,
Do
Silvio.
you think that 4 million people are wealthy?
Yes, totally, yes.
No, I think
Let's talk
10
about numbers.
families are wealthy.
Come on.
What is the U.S. position between this movement where the elites in the gas-rich province are trying to get more and more autonomy and do business directly with the outside world, going around the Morales government? What do you think the U.S. action is?
I think politics is dividing the country, not the external politics.
Well, as always, United States does the things after studying very well the internal contradictions. They are not new in this business, and so they know how to exploit the internal contradictions. And I think this is a long-term process. It is not for tomorrow. Yeah. So I think they are just trying to put some fuel in the fire so that things are much more excessively polarized.
I think that this country was broken since the beginning, and I think that our main enemy is not the United States, not Venezuela, it was not the Soviet Union in the past, is poverty. And we have to focus on working on poverty. I don't think it's going to be for good. And I agree, the Washington consensus failed, but that failure led us to believe that the economic model was the problem. And now Evo Morales is struggling, trying to change something that he cannot change. He has to live with that, and he is facing that reality.
So are you saying that the United States is just sitting back and watching this process?
I think so. I think so. At this moment, it is doing that.
That's very naive. Yeah.
What do you think is happening?
Because I know a little bit of history, and I know of the interventions, and I don't know why they should stop intervening. They intervene through multilateral organizations, and they intervene ideologically too. There is a big fundamentalism about Western culture, Western science, and I think Evo Morales can be the beginning of a change, because I think of change in an indigenous term. I think of Pachacuti, which is turning the world upside down, and showing what was hidden for centuries. And in that sense, I think that this is only the beginning. I have rejected other people to own my destiny.
That's a real last word. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to you too.
Coming up on Inside USA, more from La Paz, Bolivia, as we continue our look at Latin America's newfound defiance towards the United States.